Good morning and welcome to the Economics of Abortion webinar. I'm Naomi Walker, Vice President at the Economic Policy Institute, also known as EPI. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that uses the tools of economics to shine a light on rising inequality and advance federal and state policy reforms which deliver economic, racial, and gender justice for workers in this country. Today's event is co-hosted by EPI and the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Many of us are still reeling from last week's not unexpected decision by the Supreme Court to strip patients of their right to a safe abortion. While abortion rights are often framed solely as a culture war issue, the loss of the freedom to decide if and when to have children has enormous economic implications for millions of women and abortion patients. We have lined up a brilliant panel of researchers and advocates to share their work with us on this issue. First up, we're going to hear from EPI's own Asha Banerjee, an economic analyst who recently appeared on CNN and in many other news outlets to discuss her blog post, Abortion Rights Are Economic Rights. Asha's research and advocacy really seeks to understand the persistent racial disparities and uneven economic outcomes in the labor market and the macroeconomy more broadly. Next up, we'll hear from Kate Bond, who's actually joining us from Geneva, the Director of Labor Market Policy and Chief Economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Her areas of research include gender, race, and ethnicity in the labor market. And Kate has also served in the past as Executive Vice President for the International Association of Feminist Economics. Mayra Pineda-Torres is the incoming assistant professor in the School of Economics at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And her research interests lie at the intersection of health economics, labor economics, and gender economics. And her current body of work studies the health and economic impacts of access to reproductive health care. We're also really pleased to have with us Kwajalein Jackson, who is a respected voice in reproductive justice movement building with a background in economics and urban policy. She currently serves as the executive director at the Feminine Women's Health Center in Atlanta, which is a multiracial, multi-generational nonprofit that's committed to accessible reproductive health care and abortion access in the South. And Emma Roth, a civil rights attorney and gender justice advocate at the National Advocates for Pregnant Women, will close out our panel. NAPW works to ensure that women don't lose their constitutional and human rights as a result of pregnancy, and defends women who are pregnant and have abortions, who experience pregnancy loss, use drugs or alcohol, and who continue their pregnancies and give birth. So we are so delighted to have this stellar panel with us today. We'll share the links to the research and campaigns that you'll hear about during today's webinar. And if you have questions for our speaker, please be sure to share them in the Q&A sections at the bottom of your screen. We'll have plenty of time reserved at the end for discussion, and we'll also share the recording after the webinar. So next, I will turn it over to Asha.
Hi, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be on this fantastic panel today. So what I'm going to be doing is setting the stage broadly for how Roe v. Wade being overturned and the loss of abortion access is one of the most pressing economic issues and challenges facing us. First, a note on framing. As Naomi said, abortion is often framed as a culture war issue, sort of this religious sideline issue. There is this narrative out there that people or voters don't care about abortion, but rather kitchen table, bread and butter economics, jobs, and the economy. But these are not separate issues. Abortion rights are deeply connected with jobs, the type of jobs women and other abortion patients take or are unable to take, as we'll learn more from our later panelists, and the economy as whole, not to mention the larger issues of economic security, independence, and mobility for millions of women and other abortion seekers. Justice Alito wrote in the Dobbs decision that there is, quote, this empirical question that is hard for anyone, and in particular a court, to assess, namely the effect of abortion on the right of society, and in particular on the lives of women. So essentially that we just don't know how the right to an abortion impacts women. Well, actually, empirically, and especially empirically, we do know a lot. There is a very rich social science and economic literature detailing just how abortion access or abortion denial impacts women's economic outcomes and trajectories. And our next two panelists will go into that research more thoroughly. But to put it very broadly, abortion access can lead to better educational attainment, which can lead to better jobs, more earnings, and the ability to choose whether and when to have children, at what point in life, when you're financially, economically ready, is key to economic security and freedom. And to me, that is what is at the heart of the economic argument here, that taking away these rights takes away women's autonomy, their dignity, and the freedom to exert their own choices in the economy. And what I'll do is I'll close out with a call to also look at this issue in a larger economic context. The states where abortion bans are going to fall, have already fallen and are likely to be banned soon, this is an additional economic blow. What I mean by that is that in the 26 states which are likely to ban abortion after this decision, these states already have an economic architecture with low wages, barely funded public services, reduced access to healthcare. Many have not expanded Medicaid, and many have little worker power. So this decision and this legislation is hitting first in the states where it is as economically difficult as possible to support oneself, let alone carry out a pregnancy and raise a child. And to make this point, I will share my screen. Okay, so what we can do is we can see that these are the 26 states which either have the trigger bans, have pre-Roe v. Wade bans, or are very likely to ban in the near future. And then if we look, many of these states also have absolutely the lowest minimum wages. In these 26 states, the average minimum wage is $8.39 compared to $11.48 in the states which are not banning abortion. We can see, 40% of these states have not expanded Medicaid. Incarceration also becomes important because a lot of the bans that we are seeing in these states have a criminalization aspect to it. And the national rate of incarceration is 419 per 100,000 people, which is already very high. And in the 26 anti-abortion states, this is 439. And you can see in Texas, it's much higher than that already, compared to 272 for the states not banning abortion. All but two of the states are quote unquote right to work states, which makes collective action and unionization much harder. So with that, I will stop sharing. All of this to say, and I will close out and pass it on, that state policymakers and advocates absolutely must recognize that the fall of Roe v. Wade is an economic issue. This is not a sideline cultural issue. And that is the first step in coming up with solutions and strategies, solidarity and organization for what will certainly be a steep battle to win these rights back. And to go a little more thoroughly into the economic research, I will pass it on to Kate Bond.
Thank you so much, Asha, and thank you, Naomi, and thank you to everyone at the Economic Policy Institute for being partners with Equitable Growth in putting on this webinar. It's such an honor, and it's very exciting to go through this hard time, but with partners in the economic policy space who are also just as enthusiastic as we are about doing this work. And I'm really thrilled to be here with the other panelists who are going to share their expertise. I'll start giving sort of some broad architecture to how this has an economic impact on people who can get pregnant. And so I think what we know is that bodily autonomy is really critical to economic opportunity and economic justice. And I sit here about to go to the Feminist Economics Conference, which feminist economics has truly sort of been a pioneering field of economics, and understanding how one engages in what we call the economy is not separate from their life. Someone's personal life, someone's family, someone's choices about their own bodies are intimately a part of how they also engage in the economy. They are not two separate spheres. And I think the research on how abortion access impacts people who can get pregnant really makes that case very clear. And so the research itself, I look at how I understand these costs through direct impacts, which are sort of the immediate cost to people who get pregnant, and indirect costs through shaping how people plan their lives and invest in their futures. So direct impacts are related to the cost of obtaining the procedure and the cost of bringing a pregnancy to term. And we know from previous research that price variability does really change demand for abortion care. And in particular, workers who are already facing economic precarity are really sensitive to the cost of being able to access abortion care. So research that looks at initially when abortion was federally legalized, how that reduced the cost of abortion because it was easier to maintain it, sort of economic principles, when there's a wider availability, the cost may be lower. People were able to exercise a higher demand or access those services. And we know the opposite is true too, that particularly access to funding for abortion through Medicaid, while Medicaid funding for abortion is banned through federal dollars because of the Hyde Amendment. Some states do have state level funding for abortion care. And we know in particular Latina women are really sensitive to the ability to have insurance funding for abortion. So we know that the cost is really relevant to women. And now we're also facing a world in which the costs include traveling, taking time off of work, having to care for childcare. And these are all really direct costs on women, as well as the costs if they bring a pregnancy to term that they had not intended to. There are really direct immediate costs. And that is not just what happens year over year. We know income volatility, this is in essence, income volatility has a long-term impact on people's economic security. And then the indirect impacts are how this fundamental uncertainty shapes broad decision-making. So fertility has an impact on planning for one's future directly, but also directly shaping the sort of investments or risks we can take in the labor market. So for example, in Caitlin Knowles-Meyer's research, who's been an economist who's really led on this topic, she looks at the complementarity of increasing access to contraception and abortion. So contraception may have had an impact on the decision to enter higher education, but those investments could only be realized with the increased autonomy that is allowed for by access to abortion as well. And I have also done some research on this where I look at targeted restrictions of abortion providers, which laws that are designed to foster the closure of abortion clinics. And I look at how that impacts occupational mobility, which I think is sort of a really good metric of understanding how this broadly shapes opportunities that people have access to. And women in states that have trap laws are 7.6% less likely to go into a higher paid occupation year over year than women in states without trap laws. And this is even when we're controlling our state unemployment rates, state GDP, attitude towards abortion. We know that just living in a state that has this more oppressive regime with regards to women means women are not taking those risks and going into higher paid occupations that would offer them more economic security. And then sort of the last economics piece that I think is relevant too is the backdrop of the current moment. So women's increased labor force participation and earnings have been the single factor that have maintained family incomes in the past 40 years. So we know that women are really critically the backbone of the economy, but at the same time, the United States is unique among advanced economies in having had declining female labor force participation in the past 20 years. And then in the more recent moment, we've had a really remarkable recovery from the pandemic, 2 years to nearly get back to our previous levels of employment, but that is still really tenuous and not everyone has shared equitably in that recovery, particularly women of color, Black and Latina women have not recovered their full employment. And these are precisely the women who are more likely to face the most severe impacts of these abortion bans. And we're in this really tenuous place in our recovery where we're holding back those workers who already have not fully gained in where we've made it in the recovery so far. But I don't just want to center the argument that reproductive justice is good for economic growth as a reason to strive for equity. I really want to emphasize that economics research here is how we understand the depth of how harmful this is to women. It just brings light to those inequalities. It's not that it's about making sure we have a more efficient, equitable, more efficient economy that is good in and of itself, but really this just helps us understand the broad harms that this will cause to women. So with that, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone else will bring.
Great. Next up, we'll hear from Myra.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this panel. I am very excited to be here and being able to share knowledge with the people that are presenting today. And I will build a little bit on what Kate said about what we know from research. And I will dig a little bit into this because I want to make the point that we have learned a lot from research what happens when people don't have or have access to abortion services in terms of economic impacts, and also make the point that these are specific restrictions when I reach that part that they haven't affected all women so far. So all these findings, all these things I will mention are a lower bound of what we can expect, because now, as of today, women have lost access to abortion services completely in some states. And in the past, these were restrictions that were affecting some women, but not the whole population in a state. So just keep in mind that these are lower bounds of what may possibly come in the next few months, in the next few years, in those states that had trigger laws or those states that will completely ban abortion. So as Kate said, we have a lot of evidence in terms of the economic impacts of abortion access. We have a lot of evidence in terms of health impacts as well. And sometimes there is this misunderstanding that the impact of an abortion ends in the moment in which a woman decides or not to have a baby. And that's the end. And exactly as Kate said, that's not the end. That's the start of a snowball of different things that are about to come for this woman or this patient and her family or those around her. So we have two types of findings here. Those that come from the expansion of access, the legalization of abortion. And there is a lot of research that has shown that has been beneficial in different senses. First of all, we know from evidence from other researchers that when abortion became legal in the US in some states before it became nationwide legal, women living in those states attained higher education or could reach higher levels of education because they were able to delay motherhood and marriage. And by that point in time in the previous decades, these increases in education were particularly that more women were able to complete high school and go to college, enroll to college. But that's not the end of the story. Also, more women were able to join the labor force. And the most interesting thing I believe here, besides this, is that that was not the end of the story. Also, the generations that came after these women, the next generation, benefit from this legalization of abortion, because the children born to women that were exposed to the legalization of abortion were also less likely to live in poverty or to grow up in a household that relied on public assistance. And also when these children became adults, there is also a benefit there because these children were also now adults, they were less likely to also rely on public assistance. They were also more likely to attend college, and they also were less likely to live in they were more likely to have a partner. So they didn't bring up children in single parent households. But we also have this other evidence that is more recent because there may be some criticism there that these are findings that were from some decades ago. So maybe that doesn't apply today. But there are findings that apply today. And this comes from abortion restrictions, which are policies that have been implemented more recently. And we have evidence specifically in terms of impacts on economic outcomes coming from three policies. One are the parental involvement laws, which are policies that regulate access to abortion for teenagers. And we have learned from one study that those teenagers or people who, when they were teenagers, who were exposed to parental involvement laws had detrimental impacts on their educational attainment. We have also very compelling evidence, and I want to highlight like this very compelling evidence coming from the Turnaway study, which is a study that follows women who were denied an abortion because they were beyond the gestational limit in the state where they look for the abortion. And therefore, as I said, the study follows these women. And one specific article focused on the results of this study shows that women who were denied an abortion were more likely to face unemployment, bankruptcy, delinquent debt, etc., up to 4 years after they were denied the abortion, compared to the women that were not denied an abortion because they were below the gestational limit in the state. And also recently, my co-author Kelly Jones and I have been working on a study on the impacts of supply side restrictions, which are the target regulations of abortion providers that Kate mentioned before. These target specifically facilities and clinics, and if they don't comply with these policies, they had to close. And we found that this detrimental access to abortion services because of these policies reflects on teenagers, on higher teenage birth rates, but that's not the end of the story once again. We observed that this fertility pathway that more teenagers were having children reflects on lower educational attainment. But this is very important, particularly for Black women who were exposed to trap laws during adolescence. They are less likely to initiate or complete college. And I just want to finish here because I already spoke a lot, to highlight that this finding that Black women or women of color are the mainly affected by abortion restrictions and abortion legalization, this is not something new. This is something that you will consistently find in any study about access to reproductive health care. And this is because in general, overall, women of color, Black women have higher rates of unmet needs for contraception. They report more unintended births. They are also more likely to use abortion services. So the point I want to make here is that we will observe disparities in impacts across demographic groups. And unfortunately, some demographic groups will be the mostly affected ones by the overturning of Roe. I will stop here. So thank you so much. And I am open to any questions in the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Mayra. Next, we'll hear from Kwajalein Jackson.
Thank you so much. So my name is Kwajalein Jackson. I'm the Executive Director of the Feminist Women's Health Center in Atlanta, Georgia. We are an independent abortion provider, providing both medication and procedural abortion up to the legal gestational limit in Georgia. We've been providing abortion care in the South since 1976, so very shortly after the original Roe decision was levied in 1973. In addition to abortion services, we also offer comprehensive reproductive health care, including gynecological care, trans health care, contraceptive care, STI testing. And then we also do community organizing, movement building, leadership development, civic engagement, and public policy at the state level. So we are really deeply entrenched in the reproductive health rights and justice movement. And so I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be in this conversation. I will just be really frank that there have been a lot of competing obligations and pressures that we have been facing, most recently in light of the decision being made formal, but also in the time between the original leaked opinion at the start of May. But to be perfectly honest, we've been preparing for the fall of Roe for months, if not years, because we have been able to see the ways that opponents to abortion have been continuously and unrelentingly putting myriad of obstacles in between patients and their care and using the court systems as a way to get to this point. Kate mentioned in her comments a lot of the economic barriers that we see our patients facing. I just wanted to I think that bears repeating. So I wanted to give a little bit more context to some of the stories that our patients share with us about the barriers that they face. And again, these barriers have existed before the fall of Roe. With Roe fully in place, people have faced exorbitant costs to getting abortion care. So the cost of the procedure itself, which very frequently is not covered by sometimes private insurance. It is not covered by Medicaid in many states. It is not covered by other state-funded insurance coverage. In many cases in Georgia, they passed special legislation to exclude abortion coverage from any plans purchased under the Affordable Care Act. So many people have to come completely out of pocket in order to cover the cost of their care, and understanding that the cost of an abortion changes as you progress in gestation along your pregnancy. In addition to just trying to fundraise for the cost of care, people also have to consider the time off work, sometimes taking unpaid time, sometimes requiring more than one day, and that the impact that that will have on their livelihood and their ability to care for their families. The cost of travel, because again, even with Roe fully intact, many people across the Midwest and the South were forced to travel to other states or other parts of the state where they live in order to get access to abortion care. Georgia, for example, 95% of the counties in Georgia do not have a local abortion provider. So people were consistently traveling hundreds of miles in order to get care. And again, if you have to travel for a very long distance and your appointment requires 2 visits, that also includes the cost of lodging. It includes the cost of gas, some people, the cost of bus fare, the cost of airfare. And if you are getting a procedure that is late in gestation and requires sedation, you have to bring somebody along with you. And so that person is also foregoing work, may require assistance with caring for children, et cetera. The majority of the patients that we see are already parenting. So this is often presented as abortion for young people who choose not to parent. But what is at the actual reality is many people are already providing caregiving responsibilities, and that this is not the first pregnancy or the last pregnancy. So sometimes people have to bring their children with them to an appointment. And so places like Feminist Women's Health Center have created family waiting rooms where infants can be cared for while patients are being seen in the clinic. There are practical support organizations like abortion funds that not only provide funding for the cost of the abortion, but are also providing diaper support and access to milk banks. Because again, this is not something that is exclusive to people who are choosing to opt completely out of caregiving. This list goes on and on and on. I mean, we know that the complicating realities of the people who are seeking abortion also includes housing insecurity, unstable employment, again, lack of healthcare coverage for their primary care, not to mention the danger and violence that sometimes exists in the families and communities where people are coming from. I think one of the things that I often really try to emphasize is that even when abortion was fully legal and protected by the Constitution, the lack of access has always been a reality. Roe has not been fully realized for so many for so long. And it's not actually a choice if you are making a decision between the ability to care for and feed your family and the ability to continue a pregnancy to term. Those are not equitable choices. And so we often think about the ways that poor people, people who have been neglected and maligned in our economic society, are not given the opportunities to grow the families that they want. That abortion is sometimes presented as a solution to poverty, as if you had fewer children, then you maybe would not be poor, instead of deciding how we could invest in the well-being of people and their abilities to grow their families as they choose, and making sure that they have access to all of the resources necessary to fully self-determine. The last thing I'll say before I give time back to the other panelists is I wanted to also make sure that folks are considering the economic impact on people who are working in clinics. This overrule of Roe is going to close abortion facilities across the country. And we say often that the people who are providing care, our frontline staff, our providers, reflect the very community that we are serving. The majority of the patients we see every day are Black people. The majority of people who work in my clinic are Black people, coming from low and moderate income communities, working multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. And we are going to see a huge dearth in employment opportunities for people who have dedicated their lives to providing abortion care. So finding a way to really help people who want to continue to do healthcare services, who are committed to this mission, have a place where they can be rooted and continue to support abortion, is going to be another thing that we'll have to deal with. People are going to continue to be dissuaded from coming into the industry of reproductive health rights and justice for fear of criminal prosecution, for fear of civil lawsuits, for the shame and stigma that will continue to be cultivated in this country as a result of the overturning of Roe. For all these reasons, we use a reproductive justice lens for all of the work that we do, that does not just look at abortion as a legal reality, but looks at the full bodily autonomy of people, the full human rights of people, and how we can invest in solutions that support that reality for people. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much. Those are really important points. Thank you for surfacing those. We're going to close out the formal presentations with Emma Roth. Emma?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Emma Roth, and I'm a staff attorney with National Advocates for Pregnant Women, or NAPW, a nonprofit organization that engages in legal advocacy on behalf of people facing criminal prosecution or other punitive state action because of their alleged acts or omissions during pregnancy. As many of my co-panelists have discussed, there are clear economic consequences when women are forced to carry unwanted pregnancies to term, including the exorbitant costs associated with childcare, as well as lost wages for women who are forced out of their jobs due to the denial of adequate family leave, pregnancy discrimination, or other means. But today I'm going to focus specifically on the collateral economic consequences associated with the criminalization of abortion and other pregnancy outcomes. So as many know, 26 states have banned or imminently will ban abortion following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. That said, pregnancy criminalization is not a new phenomenon. Even with Roe on the books, rogue prosecutors have filed criminal charges against pregnant women all across the country, often in the absence of any kind of valid statutory authority. NAPW has tracked over 1,700 cases in which pregnant women faced criminal prosecution, detention, or forced medical interventions since 1973, the year in which Roe was decided. In many of these cases, we provided critical legal support and assisted in getting criminal charges dismissed or overturned. So these cases take many forms and involve a wide range of charges, from murder charges against Chelsea Becker and Adora Perez in California for experiencing stillbirths, to charges against Kinlesia Jones in Georgia and Letice Fisher in Mississippi for allegations related to self-managed abortion, to the criminal prosecution of Bebe Shui in Indiana for attempting suicide while she was pregnant and experiencing a mental health crisis. Our research into pregnancy criminalization shows that the women who are targeted are disproportionately low income, women of color, and coping with substance dependency. And we know that the criminalization of pregnancy has severe collateral consequences, including economic consequences. Pregnant women who face criminal prosecution are often saddled with exorbitant court fines and fees. An inability to pay these fines and fees can constitute a probation violation and lead to further incarceration and system involvement. Women also frequently lose their jobs as a result of these criminal charges. So I thought I would walk through one example of a client named Brittany in Alabama. Brittany faced a felony prosecution in Lauderdale County after she experienced a placental abruption at 32 weeks gestation, and tragically, she lost her baby. The district attorney prosecuted based on the theory that her pregnancy loss could have been caused by her use of Adderall that she had been prescribed for her ADD. That said, the autopsy report specifically stated that factors unrelated to her Adderall use could have caused the placental abruption, including chromosomal abnormalities. The felony charge was brought under Alabama's chemical endangerment statute, which is a law passed in 2006 to combat growing methamphetamine use in Alabama. It was aimed to target adults who ran illegal meth labs out of their homes and exposed their children to dangerous fumes and chemicals. It was never intended to be used to prosecute pregnant women for any kind of act in relationship to their pregnancy. But in 2013, the Alabama Supreme Court held that the word child in the statute includes fetuses, thus opening the door to the prosecution of pregnant women. So Brittany was offered a deferred prosecution deal, an arrangement under which her charge would be dismissed if she completed certain conditions related to drug testing and treatment, even though she never had a drug problem to begin with and was only taking prescription medication that she needed. Her assigned public defender encouraged her to accept the deal. So she completed the terms of her deferred prosecution deal, and her felony charge was dismissed in December of last year. However, the felony remains on her criminal record, and she's not able to seek expungement until this upcoming December, 12 months after the charge was dismissed. As a result of the felony charge on her record, she lost her job and has been rejected from numerous employment opportunities. She also lost custody of her son, who was 8 at the time the placental abruption happened and is now 12. In other words, the criminal prosecution has completely ruined her life. Seeking expungement in Alabama involves a $500 fee and an extremely onerous process, and the granting of expungement is discretionary. NEPW will be assisting her with her expungement application, but the process is simply not accessible or affordable for the vast majority of people in the state. While Brittany's story involves a pregnancy outcome other than abortion, her case involves a stillbirth. It serves as a stark warning of the consequences that many more women will face now that abortion will be banned in at least 26 states. NEPW anticipates a dramatic rise in the number of pregnancy-related prosecutions following Dobbs. And therefore, even though the Dobbs decision will vest countless women of the right to bodily autonomy, an often overlooked part of the problem is that it will also vest women of economic security and the ability to control the direction of their lives. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Emma. That is really a chilling story. And thank you for sharing it. We are going to move now into some question and answers. There's been a ton that have come into the chat, and I'm just going to start going through them. And I'd like to ask the panelists to feel free, if I call on somebody and you want to get in on the answer to that, please just go ahead and jump in. And so we'll start with a question for Mayra. Are you saying not only women benefit in terms of their economic and education outlook when abortions are not restricted, but also their children?
Yes, and I would say like we have never documented like men benefiting from this, but I would say like if they are a family and there is a man present, he would also benefit for this. And the evidence about children is very compelling. It is based on the legalization of abortion, but if we put things on the other side of the coin, which is the abortion's restrictions or not having access to abortion, we could expect also negative impacts for the future generations, for those children born after abortion became illegal in each state.
Thank you. I am actually going to ask a question of Kwajalein, and I know you talked about a little bit about the movement building that's happening. Can you just say a little bit more about what folks on the ground are doing? What does organizing look like now after the fall of Roe?
Sure. Well, I mean, I will also just say a lot of our strategies are not dependent on the Supreme Court decision. That a lot of the strategies that we've been employing on the ground have stayed the same because our North Star has not changed in light of the fall of Roe. But one of the things that we've been doing for many years has been really centered around civic engagement and not just telling people to vote without giving any additional context or information, but helping people to understand at what levels of government are the decisions that affect your everyday life being made. So there's often a way that people like to disparage a presidential administration or cast blame on Congress or even be really angry, of course, at the Supreme Court without recognizing the ways that state legislatures, governors, and either appointed or elected judges where they live are also contributing to the reality that they're facing in their community. So helping people understand what's happening at the local level and how much power we actually have to have substantial and lasting change if we are deeply engaged, not just at the time of the election, but in holding policymakers accountable into their time of governing. In addition to that, we're doing a lot of community education, just helping people to understand sexual and reproductive health writ large, having conversations to destigmatize abortion as a part of reproductive health care is really important, especially in places where sexual education has been so eroded or diminished that it is somewhat detrimental to the ways that people are thinking about their sexuality. Working across movements, so working with trans justice leaders, working with economic justice leaders, working with environmental justice leaders to think about these things intersectionally and understand how they are affecting our communities at the same time, and that our opponents very clearly see the intersections that we sometimes overlook in the progressive spaces. So those are just a handful of the things that we have been doing as an organization within the ecosystem of reproductive health rights and justice organizations in Georgia. I'm telling everybody who will listen, support local funds, support local clinics, and engage in local elections, because the Supreme Court has made abundantly clear that they want to toss all of this back to the states. And so we need to bring the fight to the states rather than waiting on a federal mandate to come swoop in and save us. There's opportunity right now where we are.
That is really helpful, and is also a little shot of hope too, at being able to reverse some of this. That question came in about why is paid leave such an important policy for those seeking an abortion? Does anybody want to take that?
I can try to address this a little bit. Well, I sort of, when I think of these types of policies that are needed for people to be able to sort of have full, happy, healthy lives, parent with dignity, it's often also, this may be a little bit of a pivot from the initial question. It's not just about one type of policy. It's really about how they all reinforce each other. And I think that is really critical. And so paid leave is really critical is necessary if you're taking a more medium-term absence from work, like if someone has given birth or has a new child come into the family, you're taking more than a few weeks off. Paid sick is what you would take off not only for yourself to seek the healthcare you need, but also if someone in your family is seeking healthcare on a short-term basis and you need to take care of them. And we know that all these different types of things happen in someone's life. It's not one or the other. You really need these full, broad suite of policies in order for people to be able to live happy, healthy lives, care for their families, care for themselves, parent with dignity. And so we can't just have paid leave. I think paid leave is critical for anyone, regardless of whether they're trying to seek abortion care or not. But paid leave is critical. Paid sick is critical. Having fair schedules is critical. There's a whole sort of suite of policies that reinforce each other, and it really cannot be one or the other. Because I think if we're looking at any of these one policies as a silver bullet or a trade-off, if we have paid leave, and this is sort of the risky thing that's come up in these conversations, if we had paid leave, then maybe we wouldn't, there's not as much of a pressure to have secure access to abortion. And I really want to sort of say that that is not true. We need all these types of policies for people to be able to have sort of fully actualized lives and care for their families.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm actually gonna have to put my glasses on to see these questions. Let's see. Okay, there's one question that came in about, and I'm also going to ask if speakers can slow down just a little bit. We're getting some feedback in the chat that folks are really trying to catch everything and are having a little bit of trouble. Okay, one question came in about wanting some more clarification or understanding about why women of color will be, or how women of color will be disproportionately impacted by the lack of access to abortion. Does someone want to speak to that?
So I would just briefly speak for what we know so far, which is mainly based on research. We know, for example, that when abortion became legal, these impacts I mentioned before, there were improvements in educational attainment. All these impacts that were found were like the magnitude of these impacts was quite higher for Black women than for white women. Here, this is a comparison. We are just talking about these two demographic groups. And if you now look at evidence coming from restrictions on funding to family planning, not just abortion restrictions on family planning funding, other abortion restrictions such as parental involvement laws, trap laws, as I mentioned before, mandatory waiting periods. In general, the impacts are always higher for Black women. And the reason behind this, which I mentioned very briefly, I apologize about that, is because in general, there is, and I won't say like there is a total overlap between these two groups, but unfortunately there is a big correlation, which is low income and Black women. There is a correlation there. And these women are affected by the fact that, as I mentioned before, they face higher barriers to access reproductive health care because of their income, because of some historical mistrust towards the healthcare services in which they have been mistreated relative to other population groups. And on top of that, they have higher rates of unintended pregnancy, higher rates of unmet needs for contraception. And in general, the combination of all these factors make them more vulnerable to need abortion access and to face barriers to access this healthcare. So this is in general an issue that will persist, and as I mentioned, will disproportionately affect Black women for what we know so far, but there would be other population groups that will be also disproportionately affected that we don't have evidence in research so far.
The only thing that I'd like to add to that is that this is not a random accident, that the reasons that Black communities and other communities of color are so often cited as being disproportionately harmed by policy decisions is because of the generations of systemic racism that are embedded in our policy decisions and have been compounded over time. So Black communities are not accidentally more poor. They are intentionally denied the opportunities for wealth building and for opportunities to pull themselves out of the poverty that they have been in cyclically. So all of these things have to be tied back to the ways that white supremacy continues to it continues to be unacknowledged, unreckoned with, unaddressed, and perpetuated over time. We will continue to see Black communities harmed by the violent ways that our systems have not been equipped enough to reckon with what has been done to Black populations and other communities of color over the course of hundreds of years. So every time we see the sort of throwaway comment that this will disproportionately impact communities of color, we actually need to continue to draw that back to the roots of white supremacy and systemic racism.
It's a critical point. Okay, there was a question that came in. Could you discuss barriers to contraception before the reversal of Roe? Who would like to take? Is there any woman that would like to take that? Okay.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, because I got a little bit distracted. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. The question came in about what were the barriers to contraception even before Roe fell.
I could just say a little, and of course, I'm not an economist, but just anecdotally in the work that we do, people's lack of access to consistent healthcare coverage is certainly a part. We know that birth control and contraceptive access was greatly expanded by the Affordable Care Act. And as was stated by others, that was not fully realized in many places that chose not to expand Medicaid and continue to have large swaths of the population who remain uninsured. Also, ways in which people have been, potentially coerced into choosing one contraceptive method over another, and not given full information or understanding about all of the contraceptive options available to them. So really working hard in reproductive justice to give more information about how to give informed consent, how to not insert paternalism into our conversations with our patients and really trust them to know what they need for their bodies and not make cost a barrier for them getting the actual method that they need and that will work best for them. So those are just a handful of things that I know from experience.
Thank you.
I just want to add something to what Gwendolyn mentioned. So something we observe with TRAP laws, these policies that affect clinics and facilities, is that many clinics closed, but not all the clinics that closed were only abortion providers. They were providing other services. So actually in that situation, patients were not just losing access to abortion services, but to other services such as contraception services, pap smear, like preventive services that were provided before there. So my point with this is that since now that Roe has been overturned and some states are banning abortion, clinics have to close, they will probably also lose access to those other services. So indirectly, also people relying on contraception services, they will lose that. And maybe they won't be able to find a substitute or afford a substitute.
Okay, a question came in. We're seeing a lot of employers starting to offer travel assistance for abortion procedures. What are your thoughts on this, and will this become a normal workplace benefit?
I'm happy to speak to this one. I mean, on the one hand, there is some evidence that some high road employer practices do have positive spillovers. Other employers may adopt similar practices. It could sort of help more people than just even those employers who initially make public pledges. But it comes down to the same way, having a lot of employer-based policies really can exacerbate inequality in many ways. It sort of depends on the luck of which employer you end up working for. It depends whether you're classified as an employee or as an independent contractor. This also, it's hard for small businesses to compete with that as well. I think small businesses would rather there be broad-based access to things so they don't have to compete on these things. And then also the privacy issues of how does someone even access these services and what does that look like for them? And so, I don't want to disparage this because it is certainly better than absolutely nothing at all. But I think if we actually want to realize people having bodily autonomy and having access to economic opportunity, it has to be universal and universally acceptable and not based on the luck of the employer you end up at, because that is exactly like many supports that we rely on to be offered through employers in the United States can ultimately actually exacerbate inequality because it's more advantaged workers who end up working for those employers anyway.
Right. And I would just add to that, it's obviously good to see companies talking about this issue, but women or people seeking abortions should not have to disclose their health status to a boss or to management whom they just have to hope has their best intentions. And, corporate management leadership changes. And, this is obviously not a direct solution.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much space, but I feel like this indirectly affirms the idea that traveling for abortion care is a reasonable reality, and it is not. And so I would much prefer these corporations use their influence to try to demand abortion access where they are rooted, that their employees deserve to be able to have access to abortion where they live and should not be compelled to have to travel in order to get a safe and routine medical procedure. And so I think that it is useful, but there is a much more useful way that these companies could be using their influence and using their resources.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one other point, sort of going back to earlier what Kwajalein was saying about working across movements. I think this is also a huge labor and workers' rights issue. And when we're talking about, companies potentially offering travel benefits, you see other large companies making the statements, but there's sort of the asterisks at the bottom saying can't guarantee this benefit if you're a unionized store. And so sort of using this as leverage to further suppress worker power is, not a good solution either. And I think we need cross movement solidarity and seeing this as a labor issue as well.
Great, thanks, Asha. So we are going to start to wrap this up, and I'm going to kind of combine two questions into one and do quick round robin with our panelists. And so one of the questions that came in from the audience was, what can states do? What strategies can states use to minimize the economic impact on women because of Roe being overturned, or sort of state-related, what resources would you recommend to people who live in one of the 26 states where a ban is in place? And so if folks want to answer either of those questions, please jump in.
Sure, I can take a first stab at that. So we've seen mass mobilization among blue states that are going to function as safe havens for abortion, and many states are passing legislation that will effectively create state abortion funds to help out-of-state residents travel to that state to seek abortion care. So that's one thing that blue states can do. Something that states can do where abortion is banned is still provide supportive services to ensure that raising a family does not cause an severe economic deprivation for all new parents. And so supporting paid family leave, expanding Medicaid, and ensuring that people still have the ability to actually stay in their jobs once they have children.
Thanks, Emma. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to move to my final question then. These last few weeks, months, years fighting on the reproductive justice lines have been tough. Last week was brutal. I wanted to know what signs of hope you see, or what is inspiring you to keep going in this work despite all the terrible policy decisions and court decisions we're seeing. Asha?
Right. Well, actually, first, I do want to say something about your earlier question about what is something we can do. And I think what we're seeing about this decision is that, it's not about women or motherhood or babies. This is about power and control and subjugation. And so anything, state policymakers can do to empower and support is what is needed at the moment. And as for what makes me feel hopeful, unfortunately, this is not the first dehumanizing, horrible decision coming from the highest institution of the land. And the way things are going, it will not be the last. I swear that is not my point. My point is that what has preceded these decisions and what I know will outlast these decisions are the community, the people on the ground, and the solidarity across the country, across the movement, across movements that will, bring us forward. Because, ultimately the only way forward is organization. And so I think it will happen.
Thanks, Asha. I will call on Kwajalein next.
Sure. I think like Asha alluded to, I am certainly not waiting on or hinging my liberation on the systems that exist as they are in this country that have proven time and time again that they are not interested in people like me actually living fully free, autonomous lives. So what I am really rooting and grounding myself in is the organizing power that happens on the ground, the ecosystem that we are building to support our communities, the ways that we are trying to understand and analyze the risks that are worth taking in the face of unjust laws, and building new systems that actually support the lived experiences of people. Again, advocates in the reproductive health rights and justice movement have been talking about the fragility of Roe as a protection for a very, very long time. And so what are the actual ways that we can affirm and solidify the right to bodily autonomy that extends beyond the protection of privacy, that extends beyond what's happening in a uterus, but is really about the way that people fully realize themselves and exist in the world? What are the ways that we can stand firmly 10 toes down in that? Those are the things that I want to be building movements towards.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to Emma and then Myra, and then give Kate the last word.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Kwajalein. I think that these moments of severe rights deprivations, while utterly devastating and while many lives hang in the balance, the only silver lining is that there is the potential for mass mobilization and for community engagement and for people to take reproductive justice seriously, not as a fringe women's rights issue, but as a fundamental issue affecting all of our human rights.
Myra?
So in terms of what gives me hope, I would say very little, but I would say like something that Kwajalein said really inspired me, which is abortion providers have been preparing for this. This is not something they didn't expect, but it also makes me wonder, what do they need? Because maybe the states won't be able to provide what they need. And we have learned from all these clinics that have closed so far, that those that remain open face an excess demand for their services. They cannot just take care of all women who need an abortion. So I would say, like, just going back to your question, maybe one approach is to actually ask the abortion facility what they need, instead of expecting from the state to provide funding or other states to send funding that may never reach. Maybe just approach the local facility that is close to wherever you are and ask what they need, if they need resources, if they need volunteers. So I don't know, maybe Kwajalein can say better about it, but it's what made me think everything she said.
Yes, I like that. Everything she said. Yes. And turning it over to Kate for our final word.
Thank you so much. And yes, seconding everything everyone said. And I think one thing that has sort of kept me going, the mobilization of people's skills across sort of the variety of fields that they work in. I'm an economist who works in economic policy, and broadly the field of economics has not centered justice issues like this historically, but we had 154 economists sign on to an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. We have economists talking about this constantly, which is like not just economists who work on these issues, but across fields, thinking about how this interacts with their own work. I am really lucky to work at an organization of people who also have, communications experts, people who work with academics, people who are writers, all engaging and bringing their skills to this movement, but then doing events like this and really looking to leaders in reproductive justice as for guidance. And so echoing some of what Mara said is that looking towards people who work in reproductive justice for guidance about how to use our skills in this moment and bringing those skills to really try to bring about structural change on these issues.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So I just want to give a huge thank you to our amazing presenters, and thanks to all of you who joined us for this really important discussion. We're going to send out a recording of the webinar along with the links to the resources that have been shared during our conversation today. And if you want to find out more about EPI events and research, please go to epi.org and also follow us on social media at Economic Policy. So thank you again, and we will see you soon. Thank you.